My name is Peter Crooks, and it's my privilege really to be coordinating this multi-annual lecture series from the Long Room Hub, Out of the Ashes, Collective Memory, Cultural Loss and Recovery. And this is the second year of a 3-year series that's running at the Hub, connecting with a project that I'm directing called Beyond 2022 that looks forward to, it's now only about 1,000 days away, the centenary of our disaster, the fire of 1922, and the cultural loss that this country experienced then. And with this lecture series, what we are seeking to do is to place that event in its widest possible context, globally, chronologically, and so on. So we have 3 years of lectures. Last year our theme was collecting and collections, the power of collecting, the social, symbolic power of the great collections of the world. And the lectures took us right away from the ancient library of Alexandria, rebuilt in contemporary times, up to the world of Google's meta collections, and we went back into the Middle Ages, which is my area, to the Anglo-Saxons and the British Library collections, and then we finished the year with the collection of Timbuktu that was threatened. The Timbuktu manuscripts were threatened within the last decade by conflict and now also by environmental damage in the Sahel. This year the theme is more directly moving from collecting to destroying, before we move towards recovering in year 3. These themes are all intertwined, but in the coming year we'll hear about the museum in Brazil, which you know was tragically destroyed. We'll hear about the Kenyan migrated archive, which you may or may not know is this extraordinary story of how these post-colonial archives were brought out of Kenya at the time of decolonisation and hidden, as it were, from view until brought into the public light recently. And we'll also be looking at our own 1922 experience later this year itself. But today's theme, connecting a number of those subjects, is looking at recovering a different type of archive. And this is something that I'm very keen to do. My own project is specifically an archival project, an archival recovery project, but we want to think about the historical records, the experiences of the past, and how we remember in as wide a way as possible. And so, in exploring a different type of archive, our speakers tonight, and we will have 2 speakers, are looking at an archive of testimonies recovered from the voices of ordinary people. So the archives that are usually hidden or forgotten or suppressed by history, and that we have to work extra hard against the grain to bring out. We'll have 2 speakers, as I say. Our main speaker is Professor Sushaita Mahajan from JNL in New Delhi, Professor of History there, and visiting the Long Room Hub this semester, where she's working on a biography of Gandhi's last years. But our speaker is author of Independence and Partition, the Erosion of Colonial Power in India, and that title alone tells you how this expertise connects very directly with issues that are extremely topical at present. Professor Mahajan's fields of interest span the 20th century, its politics, political economy and social change, but also more specifically, and a theme that will be emerging in tonight's lecture, the oral history of independence, of freedom and partition. So that will be a paper that will last about 45 minutes. And then I'll ask Anna Bryson, Dr. Anna Bryson, senior lecturer from Queen's, who works on a complementary area within an Irish context, to respond to that for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open up the discussion to the floor, and I hope we'll have a very lively discussion. I'll introduce Anna properly closer to the paper. If I do it now, I'll be doing an injustice to all those achievements, so I'll pop up again momentarily. Just to say that the lecture tonight is being podcast, and there's a growing archive of these lectures on the Trinity Long Room Hub web pages, which I encourage you to look at if you missed any of last year's. It's fascinating to see those themes emerging as a sort of narrative in themselves. We're also on Twitter this evening. If you want to join the conversation that way, the Twitter handle is @TLRHub, and the hashtag is #HubMatters. So either through the Twitter sphere or through the Q&A later, I hope you will join the conversation. But now, please join me in welcoming our first speaker this evening, Professor Sushaita Mahajan. Thank
you. Well, thank you so much, Peter. It's really a privilege to be here, back, I would say, at the Long Room Hub, which is really, for me now, a home away from home. And this is a moment when I would like to thank Jane Ohlmeyer for all that she has done to make us so comfortable here over the years, and and evolving a space where an exchange of ideas is possible in a way one never thought was going to be possible in the Western world, you know. But thank you so much. I just need help for just 1 minute from trying.
If you just press the space bar to go.
The space bar, that's all?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, sorry. Oh, that's it. Okay, fine. Okay. Well, I'll just begin with two images. As you can see, nothing much to explain. Gandhi on 15th August, he was not in New Delhi. He was not part of any celebrations. He was sitting on fast, consoling victims of communal violence in Calcutta, and then of course Nehru from the Red Fort of Delhi announcing freedom. Just to get a sense of the fact that independence came, but along with it partition, two very contradictory realities. For a historian buried in the colonial archive and the written word, what does going beyond the archive mean? For me, it has meant a journey into the domain of oral history, or what we sometimes call memory work. And I have found that it is particularly apposite, this domain of oral history or memory work, to recover the voices of those, in our case, two groups of people, those who worked actively in the freedom struggle, and then of course the voices of the survivors of the partition. Recovering these voices often entails amplifying the voice of those historically silenced. And this can also be in the case of the voices of freedom, because very often we only hear the story from the point of view of Mountbatten, Nehru, Gandhi, but not what it felt like on the ground, in the village. History is much politicized in India. If you think it's politicized in Ireland, just take a break. It is at the center of the entire debate between right-wing and liberal secular forces at present. When the right-wing regimes come to power, the first thing they do is they change the textbooks. Storytelling and oral testimonies then can provide a powerful platform for remembering and forgetting. This dialectic I'll come to in a while, these contested narratives. In this presentation, I look at the interface between memory and history, and I find that memory sometimes intertwines with history, creating a burden somewhere, lifting the veil elsewhere. In the fascination today with memory, memory work, memory studies, memory sometimes gets set up, and this is something which is difficult for a historian, as a kind of binary to history. The kind of statement which Agha Shahid Ali in a very famous poem called Farewell had written, "My memory is again in the way of your history." Now that sentiment comes across very often today in the writings on partition. History gets presented as the meta-narrative, as history with a big H, and memory is presented with a small m as an expression of the small voice, often marginalized. The writing on memory and history in the context of partition has usually seen the two as counterposed to each other. Gyanendra Pandey, one of our very fine historians, would have it that there is a wide chasm between the historian's apprehension of 1947 and what we might call a more popular survivor's account of it. between history and memory, as it were. I hope in the course of this presentation to break this idea of history versus memory and make it a little more complex. I explore the transformative role of memory in transcending the divide between the communities locked in the conflict that defined the partition of India. Oral history initiatives in India, and there are many of them, are giving a new meaning to memory work, orienting it to showing a way out of trauma to bring about a closure. Speaking Histories, this is just an advertisement for one of these archives, which I'll come to in a while. One of the propositions that I hope to be able to advance today considerably is as follows, that while memory of conflict can be disabling, it can imprison the victim and the perpetrator in remembered histories of violence and trauma. That's the story we get normally from the Holocaust archive. Yet, I would argue that testimonies can be collected in a way that has the potential of overcoming the binary of a victim-perpetrator in order to fashion a post-trauma survivor who could be from either community. In the course of this, some questions came up, which I'm just listing very quickly. Do modes of remembering differ between societies, and why? Is silence the strategy of the survivor, or is it imposed by the state, as many historians on partition in India would have us believe? And lastly, but not least, is the paradigm of the Holocaust limiting for other sites of conflict, as for instance, in the colonial context. Sites where I argue the distinction between perpetrators and victims is not so black and white, in the sense that a perpetrator in one place, coming from one community, could often be the victim, a person from that community in another context. But before I go into this whole very vexed issue of the oral histories of partition, let me take a look at a somewhat more simpler, if I can call it that, account of the recovery of the voices of freedom. This takes me back to the mid-80s, when some of us at the JNU in Delhi began to collect oral histories of the national movement, conscious the time was running out. People were getting old and nobody was recording their testimonies. These interviews, spanning the years 1984 to 87, covered a fairly wide swathe of India, from Kerala, Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh in the south, to Maharashtra and Gujarat in the west, Uttar Pradesh in the north, Punjab and Bihar also in the north. Testimonies of hundreds of freedom fighters were collected. This oral history project was not located in a studio or an archive, as is often the case. It was literally a field project. Our team traveled across the country by bus, train, rickshaw, cycle rickshaw that is. I recall our stay in villages, sleeping on the floor, or in shabby pensions, eating bananas and bread in Suryapet in Telangana, or sometimes being royally hosted by freedom fighters who had now turned prosperous landowners, as for example was often the case in coastal Andhra, again in the south of India. Now something which is from the point of view of the practice of oral history, those of you who are interested would find this part important. Very quickly we found that we had relegated the questionnaire to the back of our head, put it back in our bags as it were, and we evolved what was called the life story approach, which we later on found was something which many others were using. There were many reasons for this, and I'll just take up very quickly two of them. One is that memory was very sharp for early childhood. Something, if you talk to a physician, he will tell you this is borne out by medical science, that even people with dementia, Alzheimer's, etc., or just forgetting after an age, you may not remember where you've left your bunch of keys, but you remember in vivid detail down to the smell of a particular locality that you might have given your first speech in, or where you might have been arrested at age 16. And so that vividness of your memory is very great in early childhood. The second is what I'm calling that you can avoid the fallacy of hindsight. And this for me has been very important. That is when you go with a set of questions to a respondent and you ask them a question, okay, now what did you do in 1942? Where were you when Gandhi gave his speech? What were you doing in the movement? He will very often give you a stock answer. If he's a communist, he will give you the party line. That is an ideological line. But if you take the person back into childhood and start the process of what is called remembering, very literally, and then take a person through from childhood, okay, where were you born, what did your parents do, okay, and then when he recounts his story or she recounts her story, you find she is giving you the story closer to as it actually happened, rather than as it has been recalled. Because hindsight and looking back on something in a flashback way brings in all kinds of distortions in which your sentiments about something, think about it. I often used to compare or think about partition of India a bit like a divorce, because we regret it till today. So you go to India and to Pakistan and you say, oh, it shouldn't have happened. So it's a bit like, you go back to divorce and you're trying to find out, okay, now, were we in love the day we went to the Taj Mahal? Oh, yes, we were. What could we have done to have avoided this? So a lot of these biases, distortions, which are coming in later, these can be avoided. Very interestingly, when I was looking at the Irish Troubles, and I'm so happy that Anna is here, who is an authority on these, I found that this is a quote from Hackett and Hallstrom, who have written about the oral histories of the Troubles, who've written about how the life story method was something which was very much adopted here. And exactly what we felt, they said that we also began by taking up specific events. August 1969, attacks on Catholic homes, hunger strikes of 1980, etc. But as the project progressed, we began to adopt a life story approach, asking people about their early years and moving the interview through their life. Perhaps the most interesting project today, which is based in Berkeley, but it's being run across India, Pakistan, and all over South Asia, is something known as the 1947 Partition Archive, a recent digital initiative. They are very conscious of this. I'm quoting from Gunita Bhalla, the founder of this project, who writes, she said, we record their whole story. The interview always ends, and she's stressing the other end. I'm stressing that you begin with the beginning. And she's telling you why it's important to take them through to where they are today. So they are brought back to today, to how they had the strength to carry on. There's a cathartic element, so they start talking about it more. I've seen some of them come out and write memoirs. I think people felt that nobody cared, especially in the villages. It's very empowering to have somebody listen to their story. Today, this archive boasts of hundreds of volunteers. They have recorded more than 5,500 testimonies in 12 languages across 22 different countries. Shows you also the size of the Indian diaspora. They advertise, students go in and, become interns, and for 6 weeks. This is a photograph from an exhibition which they had put up in a metro station in New Delhi, which was again, so you can see the range of stuff that they do. Coming back to our oral history project on the Voices of Freedom, I would never forget an oral history interview I did in Guntur in South India in the summer of 1984. The lady we interviewed, she was frail, she was very old, she sat in a small unkempt room, and she told us about how when she was a young girl of about 11, she went for a meeting which was addressed by Gandhiji. And many of you may not know this, but Gandhi always said in the beginning of a meeting, I am a bania, I am a trader, I'm going to get money out of you. He used to kind of make a joke out of this, and that he would always appeal for funds. And she was so inspired that she took off her gold bangles and she gave them. As we recorded her life story, one by one, members of her family came and sat in the room. This included her son, who had not spoken to her in years in anger at her having given away her land to the movement led by Gandhiji. She broke down, overwhelmed at her newfound status in the family as someone who mattered, not because of what she had done, but because outsiders like us found her story to be of merit. Shanta, our interpreter, Parvati Amma and I, we huddled together and held each other close, and we wept in joy. Parvati Amma's recounting of her past, her story, had restored agency to her. Another very interesting aspect where what Peter said in the beginning about the nature of oral archives comes in is that oral history oral testimony is particularly suited for certain types of information, certain types of history. For example, two such aspects of the freedom struggle we found, about which you can't get material easily in the colonial office, was mobilization for the movement, that is how do people mobilize, and the strategy of the movement. About activities, you can get a lot. Now, about mobilization, for example, funds we found were raised at the grassroots. Say there was going to be a meeting in a village, so the youngsters would just go around, literally with a box, and get small contributions, sometimes even in kind, getting flour, getting rice, or getting dal. And meetings, the simple street corner meetings, were the main form of mobilization for the movement. It was very much bottom-up rather than top-down mobilization. This was very important because it questioned the entire historiography, particularly coming from the left, about the money bags which financed the Congress. There was a whole writing about how Birla and Tata and others, control the Congress. So this was very interesting. It brought this out. The second aspect, as I said, was about strategy. Some of the best understanding of how the movement worked we got from activists who were in the villages. For example, Madhavlal Pandya, this I remember interviewing him in he was a taluka level leader, that means a kind of block level leader in Kheda district in Gujarat. And he described the strategy of the freedom movement, which one of our professors has described as struggle, true struggle, after years of reading Gandhi. And look what this guy says. He says, Lado means struggle, jo mile so lo, take what is given, bhogo means utilize it, phir lado. So that idea that there are, the movement is a discontinuous movement where you struggle and then you go in for a truce and then you again prepare the ground for another struggle. It was like put forward by him in such a simple way, which we would never have found. As I said, it took years for a very fine historian to work it out through reading all the manifestos of the Congress and the writings of Gandhi, but he had this instinctive kind of sense of it. Another aspect where we found that oral testimonies gave us a huge amount of information which was not covered by colonial records was the assistance of government officials to the movement, particularly at the lower levels of the police and administration. So many interviews spoke about how they had been helped by government officials. They had been told that you are going to be arrested on some such day. There was an account of how a very senior, the Home Secretary of the Government of India, giving his car to a woman activist in the underground movement and giving her safe passage out of Bombay Presidency, and this was something which was recorded. And of course funds came in, and that was all. In fact, in my book, which Peter very kindly referred to, the one on the erosion of colonial power in India, I found that there was a lot I got from oral testimonies on the whole issue of how the process of erosion of authority takes place. Just an example of officials speaking about how did non-violence create a problem? Like, what kind of a dilemma, how they found themselves on the horns of a dilemma about how to deal with non-violent movements. And what was this dilemma that they explained? The dilemma was, if you don't act, if you don't arrest the person, the other officials and the loyalists, the people who support the government, they would get very demoralized. Oh, the government is weak, they would feel. But if you took strong action, then the liberals, the ones who thought, the government should be liberal, they were the ones, they would get alienated, and horror of horrors, inquiries into this repression would start off when the Congress formed ministries. So again, this is, I think, something very interesting. How the range of material or certain aspects of the movement which we don't find covered in the colonial record by their very nature, we are able to get an insight into this. Moving on to the oral histories of partition. At that time, again, interestingly, in fact, in the 1990s, this was around the time of the 50th anniversary of India's freedom and partition. So must have been 1997. There was a lot of interest in partition. The case being made by those who took up these oral histories of partition, their argument was that so far the nation has only been celebrating independence. But the dirges of partition, they argued, had been drowned in these celebratory anthems of freedom. And the argument was that this was deliberate. And why was this deliberate? Because the state looked upon the women as our women, the women who suffered during partition, our nation, our women, and the state didn't come across very well in what was happening. This is one of the ladies, Mrs. Swani in Amritsar, who was interviewed as part of this project on the oral histories. Many feminist writers, Urvashi Butalia and Menon and Bhasin being them, the argument, as I just said, was that the Indian government post-independence, they argued, was both communal and patriarchal in the manner in which it executed the recovery of abducted women. Now, abducted women, I don't know if you know this, but other than the killings, there were about 90,000 odd women who were abducted, forced marriages, etc. at that time. And once things settled a bit, there was a government initiative from both sides of the border with army, liaison officers, social service, women who were part of the social service. They all went in to try to, that was the word, recover the women. And this was done, according to them, as part of the idea that these are Hindu women, the Hindu state needs to recover them. And Pakistan said they are our women, we need to recover them. They were not looking at them as women sufferers, but, the community that they belong to. Now, this writing on the abducted woman has very rightly drawn our attention to their plight, particularly to those who were married and had children. Because very often what happened is that when they were recovered, quote unquote, by state agencies, it meant another round of uprooting. And it meant they would often leave behind their children say in the case of a Hindu woman in Pakistan with the husband's family, because they were worried that once they went back home to their parents' family, they would not be accepted. And here I did want to add that there was this extra issue of what we call pollution, as you know, when it comes to Hinduism. The idea that the woman had been polluted because of her liaison with a Muslim man. So it was not surprising that they were worried about this. There were many cases and many films recently have been made on this. On the other hand, it could be the case that the state was under pressure from the community to recover abducted women, and they acted accordingly. I'm just giving one example. This is of a lady, Janak. She was abducted in 1947 and recovered 10 years later. And her brother brought her out with the help of the Indian Army. 1957, as late as that. She came away with her brother, leaving her children behind. As I said, she was pretty sure that her children would not be accepted by her brother and his family here. Her past in Pakistan for those 10 years stood erased, as it were. I grew up knowing her as a spinster aunt. She worked in a school, and I learnt of her story from my mother only when I badgered my mother about her not knowing any women survivors. I said to her, how is it, that you are my parents also were refugees at the time of partition. And I said, how come you don't know anybody? You claim you didn't suffer, but how come there's nobody else? And then she told me, she said, well, don't mention this. I haven't used her name and all that, of course. But she said that this is how, this is her story. Also, women were not always victims. They were agents exercising control over their lives, and when placed in new contexts, facing challenges. This brings me to a very important aspect of my presentation today, which is about Holocaust violence. And can it work? It's a question I'd raised right in the beginning. Can it work as a paradigm for the violence of partition, for example? Now, the historians of partition, I mentioned Pandey, Urvashi Butalia and others, they have often taken the Holocaust as a reference point, basically because they've taken it as the scale of violence. That's what they're talking about. And Elie Wiesel, his book, and the whole idea of bearing witness, that it is your duty as a survivor to bear witness and for the rest of the community and for mankind. That whole idea, plus Pierre Nora's idea of the lieu de mémoire, the sites of memory, this was something which was very much brought in. So this came from the Holocaust, and remembering in this whole paradigm got very much counterposed to silence. That is, Urvashi Butalia called her book The Other Side of Silence. Pandey called his book Remembering Partition, and the first page talks about how the state and the imposed need to forget. So that is what the whole argument was, that these voices have been suppressed. People have not, their voices have not, the silence is something which has been imposed. I would argue that there is a kind of dialectic between remembering and forgetting. It's not as simple as silence and then the other side of silence. Silence and forgetting are often strategies of coping and surviving at a certain point of time. Later on, this can change. This idea also came to me when I was teaching a course on histories of nationalism, and I was, one of the readings I had was Ernest Renan, the 19th century philosopher, who has this wonderful essay called What is a Nation? And one of the points that Renan makes, he says that, he's talking about France, and France had, the medieval period in France was, they had so many massacres, particularly in the south. And he said, for the country to hang together, you have to forget, you have to learn to forget about those uncomfortable parts of your past. This was very different from the importance of remembering, you know. So this idea that there can be silence as a strategy of coping. So it was not silence versus remembering, but a movement between remembering and forgetting in both directions, depending on the needs of the situation. And here I'm invoking Veena Das, who's one of our finest anthropologists, and who in a very beautiful work called Life in Words, Violence and the Descent into the Ordinary, has written about this, where she says, she reminds us again that the monuments of memory which were built to the Shoah, to the Jewish Holocaust, that before that a long period of silence had to be gone through. Debate over its historical significance and its place in the heritage of the West developed very slowly. So it's about stages. This also came home to me in an interview I had done with a very famous Hindi short story writer called Bhisham Sani, and he wrote this book on Tamas, and this book was basically about his own life. He had been an activist of the Congress Party in 1947, and this was an interview over television. And I said to him, the obvious first question, Bhishamji, you were there, you saw it all, you were an eyewitness. Why did you take a quarter century to write this novel? And he had a very simple answer. He said, I couldn't have written it a day earlier. There was a lot of coming to terms that had to be gone through. So 25 years coming to terms with what had happened. So, you know, the whole idea of what the importance, as I said, of silence, and then moving from silence to remembering, this kind of dialectic, etc. Veena Das is one of those who is very much, as I said, I'm invoking her to as part of this argument where she says that we just cannot take the model of trauma and witnessing from the Holocaust and transport it to other contexts in which violence has been embedded in very different patterns of sociality. And when we say about violence embedded in different patterns of sociality, what I have in mind is how villains and victims, how the whole understanding is so different. And this hit me. This was 2012. I visited the very fantastic Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. And I came away with the sense that whereas in the case of the Holocaust, the perpetrators, that is the Nazis, they were a clearly recognizable group. That is, here are the villains and here are the victims, the Jews. In the case of the Indian partition, the lines between the villains and the victims were blurred. As I said earlier, a particular community, a member from a particular community could be a perpetrator in one region, he could be a victim in another. This blurring of lines struck me very sharply when I read Mahmood Mamdani's path-breaking work called When Victims Become Killers, writing about Rwanda. And Mamdani discusses the violence in Rwanda, and actually himself he notes the similarity with the Indian partition. I'm just taking 2 lines from this, not the whole thing. What is he emphasizing? He said the Rwandan genocide was not carried out from a distance. It was executed with the slash of machetes rather than the drop of crystals. And goes on to talk about a minister from the Patriotic Front-led government who contrasts the two, what happened in Germany and what happened in Rwanda. And he says the Jews were taken out and killed, and the important word is almost anonymously. In Rwanda, your neighbors killed you. If you talk to people from the Indian partition, it was always about the neighbors killing you. You know, this is the stories that we grew up with. It's always, oh, we don't know what happened to this man. He was absolutely fine till a day ago, and then this happened. So one can conclude then that maybe a concept like that of the popular genocide, which Mamdani puts forward might help us to understand the Indian partition better than the perspective which comes through Holocaust studies. Another very big difficulty that we had when we looked at our oral history projects of partition was the scale, the financial support that the Shoah had. Steven Spielberg, star donors, the works. And most important, there were trained psychiatrists who were assisting survivors in giving their telling a cathartic healing turn. And this was something which set me thinking about remembering. Could one remember in a way which was therapeutic? But in our case, very often what happened was that wounds were opening up. Wounds were opening up which we had no way of doing anything about this because we were untrained. We were just going around with tape recorders or telephones or whatever and just recording experiences. So this anxiety came that, okay, if for a person silence had been a sanctuary, if forgetting had been a way of coping with that tragedy and with that survival, then can we go on talking about the other side of silence as was being done, as I said here. So silence as sanctuary, this again, my mother, I remember, a historian of partition whom I knew very well. She was at Cambridge and she came along to India and she said, do you know anybody I can talk to? I said, why don't you go and talk to my mother? She has no stories of her own. They came away very safely, but she'll put you in touch with somebody. But my mother decided to give her a story. And this episode of my mother talking to Swarna actually left two very contradictory bits of feelings for us, those kind of messages. The first was our feeling that our mother hadn't shared our father's involvement in the communal riots in Lahore in 1947 with us. We only knew that he used to vote for the Jansangh, but then so did everybody else in the refugee colony that we grew up in Delhi. But nothing more than that. But my mother had this story about how a group which was of RSS activists which were returning from burning a village on the outskirts of Lahore, and these were everyday happenings in the month of May 1947, that he gave them shelter, this group, and then they went early in the morning. And my mother found out and then she created a furor and she said, next time this happens, I'm walking out, etc. But this was something we didn't know. She had not told us all these years. The other message, and this is the message more important for us here today, is that she was quite uneasy after the recording of this story. So perhaps telling stories of partition wasn't as easy as it was with our freedom storytellers, where we felt that, we had, this woman by talking to us had got agency and etc. etc. Maybe old wounds opened up, perhaps silence had been a sanctuary. So there was a worrying kind of thing which came to her mind. This brings me to some work which I did here at the Hub, which was on the oral histories of partition, of the Irish Troubles actually. And here looking at some of the oral history projects, one very interesting one was called Healing Through Remembering. That was a group. And so the idea was, well, no, stories of partition can be told in a way that would bring people together, that would help them make peace with the past. And that's what I got from the experience of these community council level oral history projects and archives. As I said, the very name of one of them was Healing Through Remembering. There were many others, the Ardoin Commemoration Project. Anna is here, I'm not going to talk about it much. The Falls Community Council was another such oral history archive which I found very interesting, based as it was in working class, nationalist, conflict-ridden Belfast. And I went up to Falls Road in the summer of 2016, and then again last summer as part of our Crisis of Democracy project. And it was fascinating the way the stories, you had Republican interpreters of the stories, and you had people who were from the unionist side, and it was exactly as if there were two different things that had been said. But I just found the whole experience, something was, really very interesting. Walking down Falls Road, the Peace Wall, the green bars, green buntings, the Sinn Féin office, and the huge murals of Bobby Sands. One aspect of the oral histories of the Irish Troubles, which I found was interesting for our work on the Indian partition, was the recognition of that public storytelling was something which was important. So it wasn't about catharsis only, that you told your story and you lived on peace with it. But there was this understanding that no, like one of the victims' sister said, oh, it's important to speak about my brother's death so that everybody knows that the system was complicit in the tragedy. So the impact of storytelling goes beyond individual healing to societal transformation. In fact, Graham Dawson, who I thought was a wonderful book called Making Peace with the Past, Trauma Memory in Northern Ireland. So where he comes up with this term called reparative remembering, which I think again is such an important thing. There are so many examples which were of, oral history projects. I'm happy to take questions. I just found this on the internet. I thought it was interesting. On the one hand, there is all this thing about come out and talk, share. And on the other hand, it's this kind of poster which shows you the bitterness and the hostility, which says, lose talk, cost lives. Whatever you say, say nothing. So it was a kind of this thing. Well, I'm just ending with the closure, the need for closure. And here I would say that it's not important, it's not enough to just tell the story. Somewhere I think it's linked with that we have never stopped to grieve. And this is something, again, I came across a lot in the Irish examples. Member of a victim support group, WAVE, saying, we were part of a culture where you did not tell your stories. I'm sure many of you recognize this. I recognize it in India. My father never ever spoke about what had happened in his life. Every time we asked him, he said, I have to go on with the business of living, right? So one can understand this. Another respondent, again, saying, I certainly never grieved properly because I was out there being busy and I never stopped to actually grieve. So these are from Northern Ireland during the Troubles, but they are absolutely true of the Indian partition. Every family will have a story of a parent or a grandparent who had a memory which left her uncomfortable, which she was unable to share with someone and let go. Sometimes it was only death which freed that person with a deathbed confession to witnessing a crime, being part of a killing, or worse. So I'm just ending by saying that I think closure then is not only about telling, it's about grieving too. Mourning and mourning collectively has certainly been very much part of our culture. And we haven't yet mourned the dead. We haven't yet mourned our dead, certainly not the dead from the partition. This is a picture, it's a little lopsided, but it's of a group of women. These are Punjabi women. They are wearing almost exactly what I'm wearing, this black salwar kameez, as you can see, and this would be, this would be covered, a head covered like this, and you would typically do this when you went into a place where somebody had died. You covered your head and you went in, and that gesture like that, and the mouth, and if you look at them, they're all like identical. You just sit very closely together, and then there's a wail which will come forward. One person will start to wail, and then the others would add to that. And this is what I found absolutely fascinating when it comes to connected histories. I mean, I know every experience is unique, but when I was sharing this here, somebody got up and one of the girls in the room and said, she came and gave me a CD about keening, you know, and the whole thing was the older woman coming up, setting this wailing and the public grief. I don't know yet what other meanings it has, but certainly, you know, as I said, on the face of it, it seemed like there were cross-cultural associations which were very much out there for us to make something of. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for a really powerful lecture. I like this idea that every experience is unique. Our experience that gave the impetus to this lecture series in 1922 was a unique Irish moment, but we have been insufficient in connecting it, and the way we're connecting with the Irish experience in the closing of the lecture is going to open up a lot of discussion. I love lectures where somebody can speak about such complex issues, history and memory, remembering and forgetting, villains and victims, these binaries that are not in fact binaries, and really complicate them. And then you do it with such clarity that we really think that it's a simple matter how you've laid it out for us. In fact, these are very difficult and complex, and yet you've really helped us think through them this evening. So I'm going to now invite our second speaker to respond. Dr. Anna Bryson is Senior Lecturer in the School of Law in Queen's in Belfast. She's leading two projects funded by the ESRC, and the titles of them will immediately make it apparent how her research connects with the theme this evening. Apologies, abuses and dealing with the past is one, lawyers, conflict and transition is another. I know that Anna's been very closely involved in developing at a policy level how we deal with the past and issues of oral history and practice and so on. So please welcome Anna Bryson.
Okay, thanks very much, Peter, and thanks really both to Jane and Peter together with Sushaita for inviting me to join in the discussion this evening. I think Sushaita's paper has very helpfully teased out indeed some of the shared opportunities and challenges that underscore post-conflict oral history work in Ireland and in India. So in the course of the next 10 minutes or so, I'll try to add to that discussion, firstly by giving you a very brief overview of some of the oral history work I've been involved in recent years, and in particular, as Peter alluded to there at the end, the work that I've been involved in around debates about creating an oral history archive as part of the Stormont House Agreement. So very briefly then, since completing a PhD in oral history here at Trinity a long time ago, I've worked on a number of large-scale projects, all with an oral history component. The first focused on Irish political prisoners 1920 to 2000. That was underpinned by archival work really, but complemented by 160 lengthy interviews. From there, I went on to work on an EU-funded project called the Peace Process Layers of Meaning. Again, oral history was central. We had an oral history archive of 100 interviews, and it was quite interesting because it was trying to document both from above and from below, so deliberately juxtaposing interviews with household names, your Bertie Ahern's and so forth, juxtaposing that with interviews with fire and rescue personnel, with homemakers, with educators, with people who had lived through the conflict, if you like, at ground level. Now 6 years ago I moved with my family to Belfast and took a job at Queen's working on one of the projects Peter mentioned, Lawyers in Conflict and Transition. And again there was a significant interview component to that project. It operates across 6 countries around the world, but the aim was to conduct 120 interviews with struggle lawyers, cause lawyers and others linked to that theme. Now my interviewing experience, coupled I think in hindsight with a fair dash of chutzpah, enabled me to persuade a team of lawyers that what Queen's Law School really needed was an oral historian. But they took me on, and since then I've been working at carving out a career at the interface of oral history and what my legal colleagues would term transitional justice. So, as most of you know then, to turn to this Stormont House Agreement, the work that we've been developing around that, you mentioned the issue of silence, Sushaita, and the issues that perhaps sometimes we have to avoid as a coping mechanism. And I think in many ways dealing with the past was one of those issues that at the time of the Good Friday Agreement was just too hot to handle. We couldn't really get agreement at that point on a package of measures to deal with the past. And instead, since then, what we've had is a very piecemeal approach to dealing with the past. So issues cranking through the courts, inquests, civil actions. We've had reports from the Office of the Ombudsman and so on and so forth, individual inquiries. And there's been numerous attempts to try and put it all together. We had Ames Bradley, Hass O'Sullivan and so forth. But the latest attempt to agree a suite of measures that could more holistically deal with the legacy of conflict was agreed in late 2014 by the British and Irish governments and the 5 main parties. And I think interestingly for our purposes this evening, that included in the suite of mechanisms was, as we expected, a prosecutorial mechanism, so the Historical Investigations Unit, the ICIR, the Independent Commission for Information Retrieval, so that victims could get information about how their loved ones died and so forth, an implementation and reconciliation group, and then, as I say, for our purposes, interestingly, a fourth key mechanism was an oral history archive. Now, that was designed to provide a central place for people from all backgrounds and from throughout the UK and Ireland to share experiences and narratives relating to the Troubles. Now, what was signed off in that agreement was really just heads of agreement, enabling legislation as necessary to give effect to the mechanisms. And knowing from past experience that the devil would be in the detail, a senior colleague of mine who'd been working around these issues for many years, Kieran McAvoy, decided to assemble a team of academics to begin to thrash out what the enabling legislation would look like in practice, for us to reflect on the clauses necessary to ensure that these mechanisms would be both human rights compliant and adhering to international best practice. And I came on board to work on the Oral History Archive. So we engaged a parliamentary draftsperson with experience of drafting legislation at Westminster to work with us to develop legislation. So we were essentially working shoulder to shoulder with the NIO. So they were working away on the legislation, preparing to put it out to public consultation. And we thought it would discipline us to look clause by clause at what was necessary, as we saw, to have the kind of optimal legislation that we would like to see in practice. It also forced us to try and grapple with complex legal and political issues underpinning all of this. And part of our aim was to sort of demystify some of those issues and to produce clear, jargon-free reports for civil society groups, for victims' organisations, to help them arrive at positions on these issues from as informed a position as possible. And in the course of that work, we had dozens of meetings with officials at the DFA, with officials in the NIO and the legacy team, with politicians, victims' organisations, and in the course of my own work, of course, with oral historians and archivists. And in the end, we produced a 50-page model bill and launched it at the House of Lords in 2015. And what that meant was that when the NIO put their bill out last year for public consultation, we were able to come back very quickly with a detailed 160-page response. These are complex issues. We had 40 pages on the Oral History Archive, and critique it in detail, looking at what we felt were the strengths and weaknesses. Now, in terms of strengths and weaknesses, just to come to the nub of it, the Oral History Archive, I suppose the opportunities that I tend to highlight would very much kind of complement what the issues that Sushaita has been talking about. So I would have tended to emphasise that legalistic approaches to dealing with the past tend to operate in a very fragmentary case-by-case basis, cater for a limited number of people, not all of whom wish to pursue justice through the courts. But in my experience, just as you were saying, I think that most people do value an opportunity to be heard. And indeed, I think it can have that kind of cathartic element that you spoke about. So in the case of my own experience, I know that I've been really touched and surprised to know that some of the people I've interviewed one of them died with a transcript beside his bed. His family member told me he kept it by his bed. I know in another instance someone read from the transcript of the life story at the funeral. So it really does matter hugely to individuals to have that opportunity. I suppose I've also been drawing attention to the fact that we can reach out, as you said, to unheard voices and explore hitherto sort of neglected aspects of our past history. So I have a particular interest in gender dimensions. And just to cut across to the project on lawyers for a second, I was really struck doing field research in South Africa on that lawyers project. You know, we're all familiar with the discontents now 20 years on from the Constitution, and the kind of the real discontent that we documented around what hadn't been delivered. And in particular, I was struck in talking to some of the female struggle lawyers about their sense of the kind of the way in which the narrative on the past has been skewed. And what they were drawing my attention to particularly was the story of sort of black female struggle lawyers and indeed Indian lawyers, and that they had been somewhat written out of that. And this is where you talked about kind of getting to that, away from that history from below. But I guess I'm taking it a little bit further and pushing us to be careful about, you know, getting beneath that again. You know, so where you can document your freedom narratives, but we need to be always alert, you know, to sort of pushing out beyond that. So an issue that they felt had been neglected was, for example, the issue of domestic violence. They thought there was a deafening silence even within the ranks of struggle lawyers who are eulogised, let's face it, in South Africa. They say that's a bit of our history that hasn't been told. And that would have resonated for me with my experience of working with our prison service, our police service, paramilitary organisations, community families. And I feel that if done sensitively, this oral history archive could help us to shine a little bit of light on some of those kind of darker corners of our past. There's an ability to get to rural perspectives. We have a very Belfast-centric history of the past in many ways, and indeed intergenerational perspectives. So I think the longevity of the oral history archive makes it stand out from these other mechanisms that are necessarily time-bound. And then as historians, that's what we can do. We can facilitate the longer view and those kind of debates that can percolate over time around, you know, negotiating memory and revisiting when the time is right. Because it's not always, as you said, people need to come to this at the time and place that's right for them, perhaps after the periods of silence that are necessary in some instances. And I think then, obviously, when we get to talking about reconciliation, I think providing opportunities to hear the other, to get out of the silos, because a lot of this work does tend to happen in silos, can help us to sort of break down those simplistic narratives about who done what and when to more complex causation analysis. I mean, that's all well and good, but there are lots and lots of challenges, as we know. So I suppose to highlight some of those for a moment or two, in spite of the Boston College tapes controversy, there was, I think, a misguided assumption that the OHA would be the easiest, the least contentious of these mechanisms to implement. And nothing, I think, could be further from the truth. Because the battle to win the narrative of the past is in many ways for us a continuation of the conflict by other means. Some elements within unionism in particular are obsessed about this issue of no rewriting of the past. We can have no rewriting of the past. And that gave rise to a commitment to create a factual statistical timeline of the Troubles as part of the OHA, the Oral History Archive's work. But to me, I worry that that could be quite a reductionist and almost dehumanising approach that goes against the grain of what I feel this Oral History Archive could achieve. So as stated in the conclusion to a report I worked on with Ian McBride and others, we really felt that the purpose of that timeline was unclear. And as I said, we wanted to get instead to complex questions of causation and responsibility, not just who fired the first shot and when. But thinking about reasons why this has been so divisive for us is of course this issue that you highlighted around the fact that we have no clear winners and losers. And for us that's probably most sharply underlined in the ongoing row about the definition of a victim. So for us then the battle lines tend to get drawn around whose stories will get heard. So this official legislation proposed that individuals would be invited to come forward and give their story. But I kept trying to impress on officials that the notion that a gong would sound and an orderly queue is going to form in the Titanic Quarter, representative of all of the different victims' organisations and so on, is naive. And Paul Thompson cautioned us about this decades ago, about a lazy reliance on self-selection. You get the middle groups in society coming forward, but you have got to work damned hard to get out to those unheard voices and to encourage them to come forward. I think there's also fears abounding that Republicans are better at getting their story out, a fear that the Oral History Archive will be flooded with accounts that retrospectively glorify violence. I think that's somewhat overstated. I think you listed some of those organisations at community level that have done some of the most courageous, actually, oral history work, taking on the task of collecting awkwardly individual accounts, both from within their own community and reaching across to others. I think also there's a little bit of a danger of overcorrection. So in an effort to avoid collecting what might be called extreme accounts and to privilege moderate opinion, we could end up with a house like my mother's, painted in that ever popular shade of beige known as magnolia, and that's not necessarily rounded either. So I think also thinking of challenges, a very obvious issue for us, I touched on Boston there a moment ago, is the fact that we don't have an amnesty or a statute of limitations. That's just a reality, and it limits the work that we do. Now, the dangers of prosecution, you might say, were dimmed by the ruling last week in the Ivor Bell case, but nonetheless, without a statute of limitations or an amnesty and the live risk of prosecution, there is a danger both for interviewers and for interviewees, and indeed for third parties that are mentioned. And that certainly has had a chill factor, undoubtedly, in terms of the work that we've been involved in. I think the issue around traumatising people as well, Sushaita, you mentioned, and I was interested to hear you talk about the life story approach as mitigating that, and I think it can go a certain amount of the way towards kind of mitigating the danger of re-traumatising people and just forcing them to focus on specific. Yes, but I think usefully when you came to talk about the Partition Archives, you were really addressing later on, you know, how it becomes more problematic when you get to some of these more difficult accounts. And I'm not sure that the life story approach is enough. I think there are other issues that we can talk about that in discussion, maybe around the ethics of all of this. But another danger, I think, just to sort of bounce across to it, is the danger of reinventing the wheel. Because lawyers have an instinct to litigate, right? Surgeons like to cut. Oral historians love to collect stories, right? More. The country is awash with valuable material. And I think that some of these resources, a lot of these resources, should be pumped into shoring up the material that is already there. And you touched on Healing Through Remembering. I work with the Stories Network that's part of that organisation. It's an umbrella group for over 40 oral history groups. And quite a lot of these organisations felt quite threatened by the prospect of this oral history archive. It's what I refer to as the Tesco or Walmart effect. You know, the idea that this new archive is coming to town and all the resources will accrue there. So briefly then, because I know, Peter, you asked me to keep to 10 minutes and I don't want to go over time. In terms of solutions or mitigating or meeting some of these challenges, I suppose addressing that ever difficult issue of trust, I have tended to emphasise the fact that I feel this oral history archive that's proposed for us needs to be independent. Now, the proposal in the draft official legislation the NIO put out last year proposed to park the oral history archive in the Public Records Office of Northern Ireland. In some ways, it was a civil servant's answer to a civil servant's problem, I felt. You know, it seemed like, in some ways, an obvious place to park it. But the difficulty we have when we get to look at the governance of that is that PRONI is run by, it's an archaic term, a deputy keeper. But the issue for us is that the deputy keeper's keeper is the Minister for Communities. And that raises problems for us around the kind of independence of the archive. And I won't go into all of the detail around kind of ways in which we try to develop a governance model that would really sort of safeguard the independence of it. But I feel that is utterly crucial. And now the NIO tell us they are, on the back of that consultation, open to looking at other models, perhaps the Linen Hall Library or a joint operation between the two universities, the two main universities in the north. I think in terms of the governance model, the other thing I would highlight is the need for an independent steering group comprised of individuals with the necessary skill set. And this is where you talked about the Holocaust, the resources, where there is a need to bring together archivists, oral historians, together with people who have expertise in dealing with trauma, together with those who work with and through victims' organisations. And I think that is crucially important as well. The need for a flexible approach then as well, addressing that issue I mentioned of working with and through existing groups. We need a flexible approach that empowers rather than threatens those groups that are already doing good work. And here I came to something like a hub and spokes model. And I looked to the digitisation of public libraries in America as an example of an aggregator model, where you have an opportunity to try and work with and through existing libraries on the ground in a way that empowers them and doesn't threaten their existence. And I think it's that type of a hub and spokes approach that we need to be looking at if we're going to kind of really optimise the benefits of this archive. And I'll finish with this because that gets me thinking about the need to accommodate a very broad range of approaches to oral history. It is a very broad church. And I think in my own experience in recent years, I really feel that some of the most interesting and courageous work has been done at the interface of oral history and the creative arts. So I'm thinking of theatres of witness, verbatim testimonies that have been performed. And when we can discuss where oral history ends and that kind of work begins, but certainly around some of the very real problems we face, around the dangers of prosecution, the degree of difficulties of opening up some of these difficult and taboo subjects I mentioned. I have seen some very interesting and I think encouraging work done at that level. And I'll just leave that there as one perhaps more hopeful thought about different ways in which we can begin to kind of work our way through some of these shared challenges. So I hope that has added a little bit to the discussion. I'm happy to take questions.
Wonderful, so thank you very much. Anna, do you want to join at the top here? And I'll open up straight away to questions. Gino Halpin has his hand up.
Yeah, can I thank both speakers for their really stimulating papers? Can I just say, the worst single terrorist incident in this jurisdiction took place off West Cork, and was the explosion of the Air India airline in 1985. And what that told us was that there was a group in the wider India who were neither Muslim, Islamic terrorists or anything, nor Hindus, but they were Sikhs. And in fact, there are other minorities as well. And you were saying how important it is to avoid the kind of just the simple binaries. But in some end of the narrative of partition, your own book shows it's not a simple binary. But it strikes me, for example, using the archive you mentioned, the one in Teamurti in the Nehru Memorial Library, that is a fairly, it's one side of a presumed binary by and large. I think it needs more supports than it has in terms of explaining to the user how the material was gathered. It needs more exposure, if you like, in the editorial processes and so on. And also, like our own Bureau of Military History, which has the same problems, but it needs to be put on the web. I don't understand how a series of typewritten transcripts, which are open when you go there, once you produce a number of different passes every day, but that they aren't, why they aren't on the web. Can you comment just firstly on that technical question of you have this terrific, problematic archive that just isn't accessible beyond, could easily be made accessible, it hasn't been. And the second one is the problem of minorities like the Sikhs, who have their own narrative of what should have happened and so on.
Yeah, thank you. I think, thank you, Yonan, for that. It's very difficult to explain to an audience who is not familiar with the Indian system how difficult it is to access anything in India. It's not because, the files have been destroyed or the usual sort of things, but there is an understanding. Let me give you an example. I edited a volume on H.M. Patel, his memoirs, and a book on partition, which he had left behind. And one of the most important bits of papers that we found in his collection was the minutes of an emergency committee of cabinet, which was set up in September 1947 to control Delhi. Delhi was in a situation where the disturbances were such that it was virtually gone. So I wanted to reproduce this in the appendix to the volume, largely to counter the Dominique Lapierre and Larry Collins type of story of freedom at midnight, and many books which were then produced on those lines, which were dictated by Mountbatten, who said that, he was the one, if he hadn't been there, everything would have blown up. He was holidaying in Shimla, and Nehru said, please come, look after everything. We don't know how to administer, we only know how to agitate, there was all this kind of stuff. And here were these, there was this set of minutes which showed how Mountbatten was very much there, but it showed how the Indian administration, brought everything under control, etc., etc. Now, they shouldn't, this was 60, 70 years after the event. The book came out in 2004. We were told by the publishers that you have to get permission from the Home Ministry because these are, from files. So we sent copies with a letter, and of course after 6 months we got a reply. Sorry, you can't publish these. Why? Because, don't you see, it says secret, classified. 60 years, 70 years after independence. So, what to do? So we thought about it. I went along to Murthy, the very library that you're mentioning, which is our best library in Delhi for a historian, and I went and opened the index to Mountbatten papers, which are available freely to everybody. They are on microfilm. I opened the index. Of course, Mountbatten was also a member of that committee, so a copy of the minutes was there. I wrote down the number of that file in Mountbatten papers, replaced that number from the file in H.M. Patel and published it as having something we had got from Mountbatten papers, which was a laugh. I mean, here is it, you have a book on H.M. Patel and you're ostensibly. But this is how the Indian establishment works. You cannot get any paper for after independence on Nehru unless Sonia Gandhi gives special permission. The letter in which you seek permission to look at his papers has to go every time to Sonia Gandhi. Excuse me, So, what you have here, the 30 years rule archive, that anybody can walk in on the 1st of January, and I believe there are queues outside the National Archives everywhere for people to find out about, some ancestor somewhere. There is no sense of any policy in place. We tried very hard, and that connects with what Anna said. We tried very hard when we had a Right to Information Act, which came in some years ago, but to bring this in, to bring the archives in, but to no avail. And yes, the transcripts and many other series in Nehru Memorial were digitized some years ago, but then there was all this stuff about the director who had got it done was replaced by another director, and then who said, oh, she shouldn't get any credit for it, so it's lying in the dustbin.
Do you want to address the other part of the question about binary? I think I was the one who used the word binary.
Yeah.
I may have
You were talking about the Sikhs, is it?
Hmm.
Yeah, you'll have to ask again about the Sikhs.
No, I was just curious because
Yeah, what about the
there's a
Sikhs?
separate partition narrative
Yeah,
associated with Sikh nationalism.
yes, yes.
I'm curious as to who's as it were curating those memories and so on.
That's a very good question. They have lots of money from diaspora. They have which funds it, and they are linking it with the Khalistan movement. There's still a lot of money which that movement gets, and it links up with what is happening in Punjab and many groups, as I said, particularly in Canada and elsewhere. So there's it's probably the most dangerous narrative, I would say, for a reason, which is that it builds into or links up with a notion of martyrdom, a historical sensibility about the Sikhs being martyrs. And the Sikh Muslim thing going back to Guru Tegh Bahadur and Guru Gobind Singh and his being beheaded, and the Gurdwara and the sons of Guru Gobind Singh, and every Sikh child who goes to a Sikh temple today, when you do the ardas, the prayer, there are words in that prayer which talk about the Khalsa, and they refer you back to that episode, so that there is a narrative of the Sikh Muslim conflict, which is embedded in the historical idea of martyrdom. and it's all, as I said, financed by the Sikh diaspora, and feeds into the whole Khalistan
Yeah.
whole
You're gonna-
movement. It's huge.
Can I take a question,
Thank
if I
you.
may, you at the back end?
It's just a footnote to what you said, like coming from a partition family myself. I realized that the only way they could recollect stories was by joking about it. Like it was through humorous recollections that it ever came up in the conversation. Like, that was the time when all the rich people were sad, but the poorest said, oh, let's go chaliye, because today we are all equal, or things like that. So it was just through humor that they could connect. So that again reiterates the premise that it wasn't a silence, but this different kind of narrative that existed. Yes,
It's a very good point. That's about humor. A particular kind of, would you call it a kind of self-deprecatory humor? Would you agree?
to an extent, yes. Yeah, absolutely. It was just, I think, in a way, deflecting the trauma, because I'm sure there was
a lot of ghastly incidents that happened.
Yeah.
But it was either that or narrow escapes that were recollected, not the harm that was done, not the lives that were lost. So that was through these very oblique ways. And how, as a historian, then is it possible to recover a narrative that has more value to it, rather than this kind of distorted, very distant perspective that people constantly build?
Could I suggest
I think that's a very
this question
very
as well?
interesting point.
Because you went to depth on
Sure,
more than one
sure.
together.
Hi, so I'm a PhD student and I'm trying to compile an ethnography of the afterlife of the partition of India, and I finished my fieldwork last year. So that is kind of where this question comes from. So I just want to foreground that. I thought your comment about the process of remembering as remembering was interesting, but I also find that in a lot of the oral history work on the partition, especially, there seems to be no acknowledgement of the fact that memory itself is a construct. It's not an absolute. It's not something that's grounded in fact, not something that's static through time, but it's a construct and changes depending on how and where you remember things. So I was wondering how whether you've confronted that in your work and how you might address that in terms of the validity of life history work.
Could we take one more question as well? I mean, package them together then. It was Daryl here and then.
Thank you both for very interesting and stimulating discourse. My question is for both Anna and Sushaita. It's about, I suppose, your methodologies towards oral histories. And I was just wondering, in terms of your line, did you have a specific line of questioning, or was there an element of improvisation in a certain interview? I just wondered, would you speak a bit about that?
I think, both these questions can apply to both of these, so I might get responses from both.
Well, just to start it off, Anna, come in first.
No, go ahead.
Okay. About the construct part, just to have it out of the way. Well, history too is a construct, in a slightly different way. But certainly today, there's no sense of, it's not as if we accept that there are. Post E.H. Carr, that was a long time ago. But the idea that you read into events what you read into them. So there's nothing, which your history being different from mine. So I think it certainly gets things messed up a bit when you have the biases which I think come into the whole business of memory. There are a lot of biases. How to deconstruct those, how to separate those, how to be aware of those. I think that's where the challenge comes. And it's a very tough one here. And partly, I think I wanted to link this up also with what Anna said. A lot of what comes to my mind when you were talking was that can we move, it's not just about life story, you're right. That's not enough. But how do we move to having oral histories of trauma? Can we place it in a sense in which we can do a kind of life history of society? That is, even by saying oral history of partition, I'm picking up on partition. Even if I think, whereas if I place partition along with independence, I've already got things a little more complex. The two happen, very different kinds of experiences. If I was to link that up with the fact that this was a period of peasant struggles, struggles for, in the princely states, so much happening, anti-feudal struggles, that there was a working class movement, strikes. So if I place it, plus when we're talking about oral histories of, say, partition, there are so few stories of those people who stood out. There are so many cases, because for every neighbor who abducted or killed, there is a neighbor who bailed you out, who hid you in his house, pushed you into the cellar, saved you, took you across the partition. Now so I think it's a lot also about it could be done from the beginning, that is, it's planned out. Say if you're doing what you're doing, like setting out and having an oral history archive, you can set it out how you want. So you could do it by saying, okay, we don't just do oral history of trauma or oral history of independence, or but they are placed in a way. You do oral history of everything, as I said, of dance, of music, of theatre, whatever we're talking about. So that, but if we've already collected it in different ways, then it's a question of placing these oral testimonies in a way in which they don't come across as histories of trauma or histories of celebration, but as part of a kind of plural, diverse, multi-hued thing, which is what was happening at that time. And I think that, please. That's why I wanted to.
No, I agree with you. There's a number of questions. I was kind of struck by the point about humour. That's one that comes up for us a lot, because there's a kind of a dark humour that underpins. It's very much a coping mechanism in terms of enabling people. Certainly when I was working on the Prisoners Project. Oh, sorry, can you not hear me? Does this work? Yeah, no, I was just saying that what you mentioned about humour is very much that comes through very strongly in terms of it's a coping mechanism for people talking about, particularly around the prison interviews that I did. I found that was very much, but I don't think it necessarily devalues it. I think it maybe perhaps what you were suggesting was that it introduced a degree of flippancy or something that found, is that what you felt, that it devalued it?
Yes, absolutely.
Because it's not necessarily my experience. I think that it's something that has enriched. I remember we launched a film here a good few years ago based on interviews that we'd done with teachers about their experience of teaching through the conflict. And there was one woman I remember, she just went in the course of literally 1 minute from tears rolling down her eyes, laughing about the kids overturning a Coke lorry, in the middle of a riot, and the kids one kid going bananas because he'd spent $1.50, he bought a bottle of Coke before they overturned the lorry. But she went on to talk about something that happened later that day, and it was tears of absolute sadness and grief at something horrendous that had happened in the school. And it's just how that flows. And I suppose then that's, I think, where you get into the complexities and layers within a single awkwardly messy life narrative, as I say, that kind of reassures me about, that even with some of these more limited archives, I think when we come back and look at it fresh, there's usually layers of complexity there. But I don't know, the methodology question, it's hard to say. Somebody asked about, I suppose I've used so many different methodologies. I've certainly done the life history approach. And it's something that I'm really thinking about now as I work with this team of social science oriented people, where I'm thinking about where the difference between oral history and, say, a more semi-structured approach, where they would say, well, where's your theory? You want to do these 13, I just put together a project actually with Linda Mulcahy, a colleague at Oxford, and we're working with the British Library and colleagues there that I know, and they're very much signed up to the life story approach up to maybe 13-hour interviews with a single individual. And my legal colleague was thinking, like, mad, like, what are you thinking? You know, we need themes, we want a theory underpinning this, we want structure. And it's been an interesting process for me to think about where oral history might end and the kind of more semi-structured approach begin. But I don't know if your question on methodology, if there was something specific that you wanted answered around.
We will have to end now in a moment.
Sorry.
Yeah. Is it a very quick question?
Very quick question. Sorry, I'm not an oral historian, as you know. I'm not an historian. Not an oral historian, but you alluded to it in the end of your talk, Anna, about the benefits of the creative arts, and you did just there as well. And I want to ask both of you about the drawbacks and benefits of filmmaking and documentary making, because in both cases, especially with commemorative work recently, 97, 2007, lots of curating from the BBC. In particular, I'm thinking of the Ricardo Pollock film, The Day India Burned, had amazing, very moving and powerful testimonies, but clearly must be problematic on many levels. And I'm thinking, of course, of Spotlight and The Disappeared in particular, and the worry that, you know, when people interview for something as definitive as a BBC document, do they think that's their definitive history? Does it curtail them from talking again to the likes of, you know, academics and oral historians?
Well, you know, one thing which came to my mind, Kate, is that, you know, with interviews, particularly with television interviews, they've had a very interesting impact, which is, you know, Australian television, BBC, they have worked wonderfully to transcend borders in our case, because we are not able to go across to Lahore, and like I would, you know, that's my parents' place, but I can't go for love of money. But they have been able to, through these conversations, get families together. Such moving examples that we are hearing about, you know, because somebody hears the father and says, oh, that's my brother out there, and then they've connected people. So, you know, it's many of these archives are also, I mean, this aspect of it, that people have just come together, they've connected, because the borders have been such that which have actually not allowed people to connect. And these digital archives are great because they are, we have our students sitting and over Skype, they're interviewing somebody in a village in Pakistan somewhere, and then they put it on the website, and it's available. And as I said, somebody's, you know, 3 sisters listen to it, and then the guy comes across, and there's a whole reunion. So it's also doing, it's also changing lives in a way which one never thought. I mean, I always thought it was only about recording, you know. But the idea that this could potentially unite families, you know, that's a huge sense of hope.
I mean, I think it's a great question. I mean, it's like sort of jealousy in me, the impact that people can have. A friend of mine just finished putting out a film and a documentary, and you think 160 pages response, who's going to read it? Like, seriously, you know, average academic article, 4 people, you know, including your granny. But, you know, the reality, I'm talking about the impact, and you were talking about digitalisation and getting these things online. So much good work, as I mentioned, has been done and is not being heard. So I think that in one sense that's the opportunity, but you're absolutely right then, the dangers as well. You talked about the Spotlight saying the Belfast Tapes Project. I think what gets my goat is I would like people to come out and acknowledge the limitations of the sample. So say with this Spotlight documentary, nobody from Sinn Féin signed up to it. That's fine, that's absolutely, you'd had fantastic testimonies, but perhaps, as we would be expected to do as historians, to be a little bit more upfront about it. The same with the Belfast Project. You know, interesting, but it's not so you alluded to that, the dangers of presenting as the definitive. I think if we acknowledge the limitations, then I have no problem with it. I remember when the woman that did my transcripts when I was doing those prisoner interviews did this type of pointillism. She was an artist, and every time I went she'd have another point on the wall which was put in, and eventually the image would come into view. And to me that's what it's about. You know, you keep these individuals, and eventually then the picture will come into view. Hopefully as
it's a beautiful image on which ends an amazing discussion. So I have to say a couple of words just to conclude. Firstly, this session anticipated to some degree themes of recovery that will come to fore this time next year when we have the last year of this series, but the theme of destruction and violence and identity and how that gets bound up together is very much at the core of the next session in Out of the Ashes, when we'll be hearing about Bosnia and the targeting of history and memory, destruction and recovery. That's from Helen Walasek, University of Exeter, who worked in Bosnia in the years immediately after that catastrophe in the 1990s. So that's on the 25th of November, and we will send out messages about that in the usual fashion. I must thank Sean and Sarah Reynolds, whose generosity has made this series possible across these 3 years, and also on personal behalf thank the amazing team at the Long Room Hub, Francesca, Aoife, Eva, Peter, Jane and Katrina. Of course, Jane's at the back there, and would want me to thank the team, who are absolutely incredible. And maybe you'll just all join me in thanking two incredible speakers and a wonderful discussion.